Russia challenged a NATO jet, and within minutes, the sky turned into a battlefield of signals, shadows, and precision.
At 9:03 a.m., 3 unidentified aircraft burst into Estonian airspace, diving across the boundary by 16 kilometers at Mach 1.74 with transponders dead cold. Their altimeters held at 31,000 feet, their engines burning at 1,950 degrees Celsius, carving heat trails that lit up every NATO sensor from Tallinn to Helsinki. Below them, more than 410,000 civilians were starting their morning without knowing that a high-speed incursion was unfolding overhead. What followed would pull in fighters from 5 nations, compress the battle space into a 22-kilometer corridor, and push the intruders into one of the most coordinated intercepts the Baltic had seen in years. Before we enter that chain of events, if you saw those 3 fast-moving blips appear on radar, what would you think was coming next? Tell me in the comments. At 9:03 a.m., Estonian radar screens spiked with 3 fast-moving contacts slicing 16 kilometers into national airspace near Vandaloo Island. Each aircraft held 31,000 feet, flying at Mach 1.74, transponders off, signature profiles matching high-performance interceptors. What the intruders didn't know, NATO had tracked them from the moment they lifted off 432 kilometers away. Thermal sensors logged their afterburners at 1,950 degrees Celsius, and networked radar stitched their path into a unified picture long before they reached Estonia. Below them were 417,000 civilians unaware that 3 military jets, together worth over $210 million, were drawing circles above their morning commute. The aircraft tightened their turns into a 22-kilometer loop, a clear provocation pattern used to bait a scramble. But this time, they weren't the hunters, because 2 NATO stealth fighters, already airborne at 28,500 feet, had closed to within 19 kilometers using passive sensors only, detecting every heat pulse and microburst of engine vibration. Their radar cross-section measured 0.004 square meters, small enough to vanish completely from the intruders' Cold War-era detection systems. NATO commanders didn't speak a word on radio. The intercept vector, altitude blocks, and timing were all pushed through encrypted data links, 128 updates per second, creating a single, silent operating picture. By the time the intruders completed their second circle, the trap was already locked. 3 aircraft testing NATO's resolve, without realizing that NATO had already slipped behind them, above them, and around them. The morning had shifted. The real encounter was about to begin. By 9:07 a.m., the intruders continued their slow, taunting loops, unaware that NATO's response was no longer forming, it was already in motion. The 2 NATO stealth fighters had tightened their approach to 13 kilometers, tracking the hostile formation through thermal signatures measured at 1,870 degrees Celsius, bright enough to mark each engine plume like a flare in the sky. The stealth jets never touched their radar switches. Instead, their onboard sensors stitched a 360-degree image updated 54 times per second, showing the intruders' altitude shifts down to the last 0.2 meters. Every sweep from the hostile radars gave away more data, beam angles, pulse intervals, frequency shifts. To the NATO pilots, it was like reading an open book. Meanwhile, Estonia linked in additional assets. A Finnish patrol at 32,000 feet moved from the east, visible by design, pushing the hostile flight westward. Farther south, Swedish aircraft waited with their radars cold, receiving encrypted updates through Link 16 at 57 kilobits per second, enough to build a perfect firing picture without ever broadcasting a signal. This wasn't a reaction. This was choreography. 5 nations aligning without a single spoken word. At 9:10, the hostile jets dipped to 27,400 feet, likely attempting to test tracking thresholds. But that only brought them closer to the stealth pair waiting directly above their blind cone, positioned so precisely that a 2-degree roll by the hostile pilots could have revealed everything. And here's a question for you. If you were in that cockpit, knowing nothing looked unusual on your radar, would you sense danger? Or would you keep flying straight into a tightening net? Tell me in the comments, because that net was about to snap shut. At 9:12 a.m., the first anomaly struck. The hostile aircraft's threat receivers began chirping irregular tones, brief, sharp, and directionless. To their pilots, it felt like atmospheric noise. To NATO, it was Phase 1, controlled distortion. Each pulse had been engineered by the stealth fighter's electronic warfare suite, recording the intruder's radar beams and returning altered reflections delayed by 11 to 27 microseconds, enough to generate false targets on every scan. Within seconds, the hostile displays populated with 9 contacts, then 3, then none. Each update contradicted the last. Their systems could track bombers the size of hangars, yet here they were, trying to interpret fragments that resembled aircraft no bigger than a bird. The confusion wasn't accidental, it was designed. At 9:13, a Swedish aircraft broke silence by lighting its radar at full 18 kilowatt output, a move intended not to attack, but to herd. The beam struck the hostile formation from the south, forcing them instinctively north. Finland tightened from the east. Estonia adjusted altitude corridors to box them between 25,000 and 33,000 feet. The airspace that had once looked open now contracted into a narrow corridor spanning only 41 kilometers. That was when the stealth pair shifted to Phase 2. Their sensors isolated each intruder's engine vibration at 112 Hz, mapping tiny fluctuations in temperature across the exhaust plume. This allowed them to track position shifts as small as 0.7 meters, even through cloud scatter. No maneuver, no banking angle, no acceleration spike went unnoticed. At 9:15, the hostile pilots attempted a classic escape, a rapid dive to 18,900 feet, hoping to hide within surface clutter. But modern Doppler radars process velocity differentials so precisely that the descending jets stood out like signals in a quiet room. Their attempt achieved nothing except burning another 260 kilograms of fuel they could not afford to lose. Then came the moment that redefined the encounter. The stealth fighters slid into a formation directly behind the hostile aircraft, close enough to monitor wing surface heat signatures, distant enough to remain undetected. 3 intruders continued flying as if unchallenged. Above them, behind them, and around them, NATO had already taken control of the sky. By 9:17 a.m., the intruders had exhausted their first evasive pattern. Their dive had failed, their radars were dissolving into ghost images, and their fuel calculations had begun to slip into the red. Yet they pushed upward again, climbing hard toward 39,000 feet, hoping altitude would restore control. At that height, thinner air reduces drag, increases range, and sharpens sensor performance, at least for aircraft designed decades ago to hunt enormous targets. But climbing only made them more visible to modern infrared systems. The stealth fighters tracked the ascent instantly. Their thermal cameras registered engine temperatures rising past 2,040 degrees Celsius, bright columns against the stratosphere barely above -53 degrees Celsius. Every spike, every plume, every fluctuation fed into NATO's firing algorithms with precision measured in milliseconds. Finland tightened its push from the east, moving at 0.92 Mach. Sweden maintained radar lock from 74 kilometers south. Estonian controllers compressed the engagement box to a span of 28 kilometers, a narrowing corridor that left almost no lateral room to maneuver. At 9:18, the intruders attempted to break west toward international airspace. That escape line lasted less than 10 seconds. 2 additional NATO aircraft, this time from Poland, had already reached the western boundary at 31,500 feet, radars cold but weapons armed, waiting for the signal to intercept. Phase 3 began when the stealth fighters shifted their electronic warfare suite into active modulation. They injected pulses that displaced the intruders' radar returns by 4.6 to 6.1 kilometers, creating the illusion of incoming threats approaching from multiple axes. Warning tones escalated into continuous alarms. On the hostile side, data no longer resembled a coherent sky. The pilots were now responding not to tactics, but to noise. Noise carefully crafted to drive them toward one final direction. Straight into the tightening jaws of a NATO formation already assembling for the next phase of the encounter. At 9:20 a.m., the airspace over the Baltic was no longer a contested zone. It was a controlled environment shaped entirely by NATO. The intruders, now boxed within a corridor barely 22 kilometers wide, were running out of both altitude options and fuel margins. Their last climb had devoured an additional 310 kilograms of fuel, leaving each aircraft with roughly 2,300 pounds, barely enough for 20 minutes at combat throttle. NATO, meanwhile, was accelerating the buildup with mathematical precision. Sweden's radar lock stabilized at 68 kilometers, illuminating the intruders with a beam strong enough to map their control surfaces in real time. Finland held the eastern boundary at 0.94 Mach, maintaining a closing radius of 16 kilometers. Estonian controllers fed constant updates through encrypted data channels at 128 transmissions per second, synchronizing every aircraft on the grid. At 9:21, two German fighters surged into the battlespace from the south. Their sensors measured micro-movements as small as 0.1 degrees in the intruder flight paths, each fluctuation analyzed instantly by onboard targeting computers. Farther west, Polish fighters formed a secondary barrier at 29,800 feet, sealing off the final escape vector. The intruders tried one last maneuver, a coordinated roll toward the northwest, descending to 24,700 feet in an attempt to break line of sight with southern radar sources. But modern sensors no longer relied on simple geometry. Multi-static tracking fused reflections from 7 different nodes across the region, calculating their new position with an error margin under 9 meters. Electronic distortion intensified as the stealth fighters raised their interference power, displacing radar reflections by unpredictable patterns. Warning tones in the intruders' cockpits flattened into a continuous signal, the unmistakable sound that the battle space was no longer theirs to influence. From above, behind, and across every boundary, NATO aircraft were now aligning for the decisive phase that would determine how this standoff would end. At 9:23 a.m., the intruders' cockpit alarms reached their peak. What had begun as sporadic distortions had now evolved into a single continuous warning tone, a sound no pilot ignores. Their threat indicators blazed with contacts appearing from 4 cardinal directions, each tagged at ranges between 11 and 46 kilometers, none of which matched the empty air their eyes could see. NATO had shifted into full-spectrum control. The stealth fighters initiated precision tracking, locking onto the lead intruder for exactly 3.8 seconds, long enough for the hostile pilot systems to calculate a probability of hit estimate above 94%, not long enough to legally trigger engagement. The lock vanished, then reappeared from a different angle, followed by a third source seconds later. In the intruder's cockpit, directionality no longer made sense. At 9:24, German aircraft established high cover at 38,200 feet, their sensors analyzing fuel states, maneuver profiles, and acceleration curves with sub-second updates. Below, Polish fighters tightened formation at 27,600 feet, forming a western wall only 14.2 kilometers from the intruders' trajectory. The hostile pilots attempted a desperate lateral brake, shifting headings by 27 degrees while reducing speed to conserve their remaining 1,980 pounds of fuel. But Estonia had already compressed the maneuvering corridor to a span of 19 kilometers, forcing the intruders directly toward NATO aircraft positioned to the north. Electronic warfare pressure intensified again. The interference pulses now returned radar echoes displaced by 7.3 kilometers, producing a sky filled with false velocities and fabricated altitude tracks. Every second, their systems redrew the battle space into a new contradictory pattern. By 9:25, the intruders realized they were no longer evading. They were being guided, pushed toward a single direction where the next phase of NATO's containment strategy had already assembled. What happened next would determine whether this incursion ended in retreat or in a full international incident. By 9:26 a.m., the outcome was no longer in question. The intruders, drained of fuel and options, had been pushed into a corridor shaped entirely by NATO. Every altitude block, every turn, every warning tone engineered to remind them whose airspace they had entered. What began as a calculated provocation ended as a controlled escort, with multiple nations guiding the formation out of the Baltic like shadows closing behind them. No shots were fired. None were needed. The message had already been delivered. In this region, technology, coordination, and discipline decide the sky's boundaries, not theatrics. And as always, the real question now turns to you. If you watch those final warning tones echo through the cockpit, what do you think the pilots understood in that moment? Share your thoughts below and subscribe if you want to follow the next chapter of this unfolding reality.